It was 2022. At the time, I was living in the Bay Area, in Oakland specifically, and that weekend I had driven up to visit my parents in Eureka. I'd planned to stay for just a couple of days before heading back. If you've never driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's honestly one of the most beautiful drives you can take during the day. At night, though, it's a completely different experience. There are these incredibly long stretches where you won't see another car for miles. No cell service, hardly any lights, just trees, cliffs, and darkness. It can feel pretty ominous. I left my parents' place around 8 that Sunday night, which, looking back, was a terrible decision. I probably should have stayed the night and driven back the next morning, but I had an early shift the following day, and I figured I'd just power through the drive. Famous last words, I guess. The first couple hours were completely normal. The highway eventually narrowed down to 2 lanes, which is pretty typical once you get north of the bay. I remember passing through small towns here and there, but eventually the road got really empty. Somewhere around Trinidad is when the fog started rolling in. Fog along that part of the coast isn't unusual at all, but this was different. Within maybe 5 minutes, it went from perfectly clear to barely being able to see 20 feet in front of my car. And honestly, it was worse than that sounds. I slowed down to around 35 miles an hour and kept going. The smart thing probably would have been to pull over and wait for it to pass, but that stretch of highway doesn't really have many places where you can stop safely. Plus, I just wanted to get home. I figured if I drove slow enough, I'd be fine. But here's the thing about fog that thick, and any California driver probably knows this. It completely messes with your sense of space. You can't see landmarks. You can't really tell how far you've gone. You can't see what's coming ahead. It becomes incredibly disorienting, especially when you're already tired. After maybe another half hour of driving like that, I noticed something standing off to the side of the road. At first, it just looked like a shape in the fog, maybe 50 feet ahead of me on the shoulder. As I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man. He was just standing there facing the road. He wasn't waving me down, he wasn't walking anywhere, he wasn't even looking at a phone. He was literally just standing there. I slowed down even more as I passed him because I was worried he might step into the road and I'd hit him. But he didn't move. He didn't even turn his head as my car went by. That alone felt really creepy. I got a pretty clear look at him as I passed, and there wasn't anything obviously strange about his face. My first thought was that maybe his car had broken down somewhere and he was waiting for help. That would have made sense, except I hadn't passed any cars pulled over on the shoulder, and there was absolutely nothing around him. No driveway, no side road, nothing. Still, I considered turning around to ask if he needed help, but something about the situation felt wrong, so I kept driving. About 10 minutes later, though, I saw him again, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it was the same guy. Same height, same dark clothes, same posture, just standing there on the shoulder of the road. The only difference was that this time he was on the left side instead of the right. Everything else was identical. I actually said, "What the hell?" out loud in my car, because there was no possible way he could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on that road. There were no intersections, no cross streets, no shortcuts. The only logical explanation was that it was a completely different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in the exact same way. As I drove past him, I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know. And the moment I looked over, I was certain it was the same person. But this time, something different happened. As I passed him, he suddenly snapped his head toward me and locked eyes with me through the window. The movement was so sudden that it made my stomach drop. I looked away instantly. I regretted making eye contact the second it happened. I pressed the gas a little harder after that. Not much, because the fog was still incredibly thick and I wasn't trying to drive off the road, but enough to get some distance. I just wanted to get away from whatever that situation had been. But the fog got even worse. At one point, I could barely even see the center line of the road anymore, so I had to slow back down again. My brain was having trouble processing everything. I figured it was probably a combination of exhaustion, the stress of driving in the fog, and what I had just seen. I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation for it. But before I could figure anything out, my headlights suddenly illuminated something in the road ahead. Another person. Only this time, he was standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes and stopped. He was wearing a hood that completely covered his face, so I couldn't see what he looked like. But deep down, I had a horrible feeling it was the same guy. Once again, he didn't move, and that's when I started getting genuinely scared. We were just sitting there, my car stopped in the road and him standing a few yards in front of me. Even though I couldn't see his face, I could feel that he was looking straight at me. I flashed my headlights at him several times, hoping he'd move, or at least react. Nothing. So I put the car in reverse, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, my heart practically stopped. There was someone behind my car, a person walking slowly toward me through the fog. I shouted, "Holy shit," and threw the car back into drive. I didn't care anymore. I jerked the steering wheel to the right, crossing partially into the opposite lane so I could drive around the person blocking the road. He didn't try to stop me. For a split second, I thought I was finally in the clear, but then something slammed into the back of my car, hard. The entire back end jolted sideways, and I heard this awful crunching sound like metal grinding against metal. Somehow, I managed to keep control of the car and kept driving. My first thought was that another vehicle had hit me from behind, but when I looked in the mirror, there was nothing there. No headlights, no car, not even the people. That somehow made everything even more terrifying. I didn't slow down again until I reached the 101 interchange where the fog finally started to clear. For the first time all night, my brain began to relax, and the more I calmed down, the more I convinced myself that I must have hallucinated the entire thing. I had been driving for almost 4 hours. I was exhausted. I'd been staring into thick fog on a dark highway completely alone. A vivid hallucination seemed impossible. It didn't explain why it had been so detailed, but it was the only explanation that made any sense. By the time I got home, I was ready to just sleep it off and forget about the whole experience. But when I walked around to the back of my car, my stomach dropped. The rear bumper was completely destroyed. There was a massive dent running almost the entire width of it, which meant that something absolutely hit me. And that meant I hadn't imagined everything after all. I stood there staring at the damage for several minutes. There wasn't any paint transfer either, which there definitely would have been if another car had hit me. So if it wasn't another vehicle, I honestly have no idea what could have caused that much damage. I did end up calling the police to report what I had seen, mostly so the information was on record. Over the past 4 years, I've thought about that night more times than I can count. I've tried to come up with every logical explanation possible. The best conclusion I've been able to accept is that I hallucinated the figures and accidentally hit something like a guardrail or a mile marker while trying to get away. But there's one thing about that explanation that still bothers me. Hallucinating the figures is one thing, but hallucinating that while simultaneously experiencing the crash, that's something I've never been able to fully accept. Because the damage to my car proves something actually happened out there that night, and part of me still wonders if there was something far more malicious going on in that fog. This happened during spring break this past year, so not that long ago. Only a few weeks, actually. I'm still in college, and I'm a senior now. Like I usually do during breaks, I went back to my hometown for the week. The problem with going home is that there's honestly nothing to do there. I grew up in one of those suburban towns that's technically close to a city, but it doesn't have any of the benefits of actually being in one. No nightlife, no bars, nothing interesting within walking distance. When I'm at school, there's always something happening, but back home, it feels like a ghost town. Another issue was that none of my hometown friends had the same spring break schedule as me. I still keep in touch with maybe 4 or 5 people from high school, but every single one of them was either still in classes or had their break earlier in March. So I was basically looking at an entire week of doing nothing, and I really wasn't excited about that. I should probably also mention that I had been trying to cut back on a few habits lately, mainly nicotine and alcohol. I figured that spending a week at home with nothing to do could either make that worse or give me the perfect opportunity to reset. So I made a plan. I decided I was going to work out every single day that week, lift in the mornings, go for runs in the afternoons, just keep myself busy so I didn't end up sitting around bored and getting into old habits. That's how I ended up going for a run on a random Tuesday afternoon. Back in high school, I used to run cross country, and there was this loop I ran all the time. It's exactly 3 miles long from start to finish, and it starts and ends right at my house. The route goes through my neighborhood for about a quarter mile before cutting into this wooded trail. The trail winds through a small patch of forest and eventually spits you back out onto the street about a block away from my house. I must have run that loop hundreds of times between freshman and senior year. Honestly, the woods are the best part of the whole route. Running on pavement destroys your knees, but the dirt trail is soft. It's quiet too, which is something I always enjoy when I run. So around 5 in the afternoon, I headed out. The sun wasn't going to set for another couple hours, so visibility wasn't something I was worried about. But the moment I stepped outside, I noticed the fog. And when I say fog, I mean it was thick in a way I had never seen before. I've lived in that town my whole life, and I don't remember fog like that ever happening. It almost looked fake, like something out of a video game or one of those ambient YouTube videos with the anime girl studying. Everything past maybe 30 or 40 feet just disappeared into a white haze. For a moment, I considered skipping the run entirely, but I talked myself out of it. The trail through the woods is basically just a straight path. There aren't any forks or alternate routes. It's literally one trail that goes in and comes out the other side. I'd run it so many times, I probably could have done it blindfolded. Getting lost wasn't even something that crossed my mind. I had my Garmin watch on to track my pace and distance. I started the workout, ran the short stretch through my neighborhood, and then entered the woods. The fog was even thicker under the trees, which made sense since the branches blocked a lot of the remaining daylight. I couldn't see more than maybe 15 or 20 feet in front of me. Still, the trail itself was easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything felt completely normal. I was running a little slower than usual because of the visibility, but otherwise it felt like any other run. I remember checking my watch around the 1 mile mark, and then again at a mile and a half. The problem started around 2.5 miles. At that point in the loop, I should have been approaching the end of the trail. There's a section where the path curves left, you go up a small hill, and then you're back on pavement. I know that part of the trail by heart. Actually, I know every part of it by heart. I've run that loop hundreds of times. But when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles, I was still deep in the woods. At first, I assumed my watch was just glitching. It was about 4 years old at that point, so I figured maybe the GPS signal was getting interrupted by the dense tree cover. The fog could have been interfering with it too. Those explanations seemed reasonable enough, so I just kept running and assumed I wasn't as far along the trail as I thought. But then I passed 3 miles. And that's when I knew something was wrong. 3 miles is the entire loop. At that distance, I should have been standing either in my driveway or on the street in front of my house. Instead, I was still surrounded by trees on both sides of me, running along the same dirt path, with no sign that I was anywhere close to getting out. So I stopped. I'm not a paranoid person, and I'm definitely not superstitious, so my first instinct was that there had to be some rational explanation. I stood there catching my breath and trying to figure it out, but nothing made sense. There's only one trail in those woods, no forks, no side paths. The only way I could have gotten lost would have been if I had physically left the trail and wandered off into the brush, which I absolutely had not done. I checked my watch again, 3.1 miles, and the number kept increasing even though I was standing completely still. That's when I realized the GPS was definitely malfunctioning. It was the only part of the situation that made sense. At that point, I really didn't have a choice. I could either keep running forward and hope I eventually found the exit, or I could turn around and run back the way I came. Turning around seemed smarter. If I just retraced my steps, eventually I'd reach the trailhead where I started, and from there I knew exactly how to get home. So that's what I did. I turned around and started running back. but the fog had somehow gotten even thicker. I honestly don't know how that was possible, but it had. I slowed my pace just to make sure I didn't accidentally run off the trail. After about another mile of running, so roughly 4 miles total, I heard something. Like I said earlier, the woods are usually completely silent. I've always assumed it's because the forest patch is too small for most wildlife, so hearing a noise out there immediately caught my attention. But the sound itself was far worse than I could have imagined. It was something I had never heard before. The closest thing I can compare it to is a moan, but that's not exactly right. This happened about 6 years ago, in late September. One of my close friends, Edwin, and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for probably 2 years at that point. We always said we'd do it someday, but life kept getting in the way. Eventually, we finally picked a weekend and committed to going. If you're not familiar with the area, Willapa Bay is this huge tidal estuary on the Washington coast. It's something like 25 miles long, and it's mostly known for oyster farms and wildlife refuges. On a clear day, it's honestly one of the most peaceful and beautiful places I've ever been. Unfortunately, the weekend we picked was not a clear day. Neither Edwin nor I were beginners. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids, and Edwin had actually worked as a kayaking guide for a few summers during college. So we weren't going into this blindly. We knew what we were doing. That's important context for what I'm about to tell you, because I don't want anyone thinking we were just a couple of amateurs who panicked because we didn't understand how fog or tides work. We launched early Saturday morning from a small put-in spot near Nakata. The fog was already pretty thick, but we figured it would burn off by mid-morning like coastal fog usually does. We had a GPS, a compass, and all the safety gear we needed. Our plan was simple. Paddle out toward Long Island, maybe do some bird watching, have lunch on one of the sandbars, and head back before the afternoon tide shift. The first hour went completely fine. The fog created this strange, muffled atmosphere, the way coastal fog sometimes does. It felt like we were paddling through cotton. Everything was quiet and still. We couldn't see more than maybe 40 feet in any direction, but we stayed close together and checked our bearings every few minutes. It didn't seem like a big deal. It was probably around 9 in the morning when I heard something, a splashing sound. At first, I assumed it was Edwin adjusting his paddling rhythm. We were paddling side by side in a loose formation with him maybe 15 feet off to my left. But when I looked over at him, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He looked at me and asked if I had heard that. I nodded. We both stopped paddling and just drifted there for a moment, listening. That's when we realized the sound wasn't coming from paddles. It was the sound of oars, and there's actually a difference. Paddles and oars make completely different sounds in the water. We were using paddles. Someone else out there was rowing. It sounded like a small boat somewhere off to our right, maybe about 100 feet away. Edwin shrugged and said it was probably just another person out on the water. That seemed reasonable enough. Other kayakers sometimes use the bay, and fishermen occasionally check their crab pots out there too. The fog was thick enough that we wouldn't necessarily see them. Sound can also travel in really strange ways over water, especially when fog is involved. Sometimes things sound much closer than they actually are. Other times they sound farther away. We waited for a moment expecting whoever it was to either call out or eventually appear through the fog. Standard etiquette when visibility is low is to announce yourself so other boaters know where you are. But the rowing continued. Steady. Slow. Completely consistent. I suggested maybe they just didn't know we were there, so Edwin called out a greeting into the fog. There was no response. In fact, whoever was rowing didn't seem to react at all. The rhythm of the oars never changed. It didn't speed up. It didn't slow down. It didn't even pause. After a while, we started paddling again, assuming we would eventually either pass them or they would drift out of earshot. But something strange started to happen. Over the next 20 minutes, that rowing sound never got any closer, and it never got any farther away either. It stayed exactly the same distance from us. At first, I actually found it kind of impressive. Whoever was rowing had perfect rhythm, but as more time passed, the situation started to feel deeply unsettling. Edwin and I had both gone quiet. We didn't need to say it out loud. We both felt the same creeping discomfort. At one point, we shifted our course slightly east, angling toward the shoreline. For a brief moment, the fog thinned just enough for me to see something. A small rowboat. I could see the outline of a person sitting at the oars. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the fog swallowed it again. The whole glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he saw it too. He said yes. At that point, I wanted to leave. There was nothing obviously threatening about the situation, but something about it made me extremely uncomfortable. It wasn't just the boat. It was the way whoever was in it refused to acknowledge us, and the way the rowing seemed to follow us no matter where we went. So I started paddling toward the shoreline. Edwin immediately followed. The problem was navigating. Even with a GPS, moving through the bay in thick fog isn't easy. There are shifting sandbars, shallow channels, and mudflats that can trap you if you're not careful. We knew roughly where we were, but roughly isn't the same as exactly, and the last thing we wanted was to get stuck somewhere while that mysterious boat was still out there. We paddled southeast as fast as we reasonably could, and the rowing sound stayed with us the entire time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping to see the boat again, but I never did. Then, suddenly, without warning, the fog started to lift. It didn't clear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see almost 100 yards in every direction. The first thing I did was look toward the area where the rowing sound had been coming from. There was nothing there, just open water. I checked behind us. Nothing there either. In fact, as far as we could see, the entire bay was empty. I looked at Edwin. He looked even more scared than I felt. We kept paddling toward the shore, but somehow the situation felt even worse now, because if the fog had cleared, where did the boat go? A few minutes later, we finally saw the shoreline. Relief washed over me. I thought the ordeal was finally over, but it wasn't. We paddled straight toward land and reached the shallows. I jumped out of my kayak into knee-deep water and dragged it toward the beach. The water was freezing cold, but I barely noticed. I was just grateful to be standing on solid ground. For a couple minutes, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, catching our breath and staring out at the bay. The fog was still thinning, but there were no other boats anywhere. Then Edwin called me over. He had walked a little farther up the beach and was staring at something in the sand. When I got closer, I immediately saw it. Footprints. Wet, barefoot footprints leading up from the water onto the beach. They looked fresh. You could actually see small pools of water collected in the indentations. Whoever had made them had only left the water moments earlier. But what terrified me was where they went. The footprints didn't stop at the beach. They continued across the sand, turned along the shoreline, and then eventually disappeared into the trees. Edwin said he wanted to leave immediately, but I couldn't stop staring at them. Something about the situation had been bothering me since we first heard the rowing, and I suddenly felt this intense need to understand what had happened. So I suggested we follow the footprints, not into the forest, but the opposite direction, back toward where they came from. Edwin thought I was insane, but after a short argument, he reluctantly agreed. We started walking along the shoreline, following the trail of prints. After about 2 minutes, I saw it. Pulled halfway on the sand was a small wooden rowboat. Dark wood, 2 oars resting inside. It was the same boat. I was completely certain of it. The same shape I had seen through the fog earlier, and now it was sitting there on the beach with wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it, but Edwin grabbed my arm and stopped me. He told me we were leaving, immediately. Something about the tone of his voice sent a chill down my spine, because he sounded genuinely terrified, and then I realized something. Whoever was rowing that boat had somehow reached the shore before us, walked down the shoreline to the exact spot where we landed, and disappeared into the trees before we even made it to land. We ran back to our kayaks. I had never seen Edwin move that fast before. We shoved the kayaks back into the water and paddled away from that beach as quickly as we could. Over the past 6 years, I've thought about that morning more times than I can count. I've tried to come up with every logical explanation possible. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, but that explanation doesn't really hold up. We were on the water for more than 2 hours. We changed directions multiple times. Eventually, we headed straight for shore. For that boat to beat us there, the person rowing it would have needed to move faster than we did in kayaks, reach land first, walk down the shoreline, and disappear into the trees before we even arrived. The more I think about it, the less sense it makes. And honestly, I still have no idea what really happened out there that morning.